what does it mean to ensure that people get the right information other than to be the one who dictates what information it is that they receive?
There are few people who understand the machinery behind disinformation and modern censorship better than Jacob Siegel. He's the special features editor at Tablet magazine.
People need to understand that the birth of the digital age is going to be an unbelievably volatile and disruptive event that could last for another century and perhaps even longer.
His recent book is titled The Information State: Politics in the Age of Total Control.
The problem with these organizations is that while they have the appearance of neutral civic organizations, they're actually highly partisan and integral to this ruling party coordination.
This is really astonishing.
The more freedom people are incentivized to give away by the promise of convenience, optimization, automation of wealth, the more likely they are to see the remaining freedom as diminished in value.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Jacob Siegel, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Jan, it's great to be back with you.
Let's start here. So you describe a whole-of-society approach that fused government, tech platforms, NGOs, academia into a permanent, well, quasi-permanent disinformation fighting apparatus. How did something that started as essentially counterterrorism efforts, you argue, turn into something like this?
So this concept of the whole of society actually begins in the world of developmental organizations like the United Nations, where it's used to refer to kind of breakneck modernization programs. So if you're going into a country that doesn't have civil infrastructure, doesn't have water filtration systems, and you're trying to modernize it through this kind of international NGO approach, the idea was that instead of appealing to the public or to civil society, which presumably doesn't exist, instead you coordinate through whole of society, which is really a euphemism for the most powerful actors, the banks, the universities, the kind of ruling class institutions. And then it jumps this concept, whole of society, from the developmental world to counterinsurgency warfare, particularly in Afghanistan, where it has almost the same meaning, but now with military backing. So whole of society is how the primitive rural Afghan countryside is going to be transformed into a modern approximation of a society that works according to rules recognizable to the democratic West. And then the final jump is into the American domestic political system. And this happens in 2009, approximately. It happens in the first Obama administration. And why exactly the Obama administration believed that the best approach to governance of American citizens in the United States was a model borrowed from counterinsurgency warfare and developmental programs in essentially pre-modern societies, I think speaks to the underlying beliefs of the people who were running that administration, who looked at the American political system and believed that rather than seeing a system in which local stakeholders needed to be respected and their own political legitimacy was based on their ability to appeal to a broad constituency and build popular support, instead they saw kind of vast opportunity for large-scale governmental and social engineering projects. And that's why they began to speak explicitly. This was in the internal language of the Obama administration, starting in the first term and accelerating during the second term. You began to hear more and more about the need for, first it was called whole of government, and then it was whole of government and whole of society efforts. And what they meant by that, again, was largely the same thing that had been meant in Afghanistan, which was that if you were trying to push through some kind of new policy, let's say Obamacare, a sweeping new healthcare regime, rather than necessarily needing to build up popular support by appealing to not only the general population, but also to local political parties. Instead, what you could do is you could coordinate support of the most powerful institutions, what were called the stakeholder institutions. And by doing that, by getting the media, the universities, the banking institutions, the large medical organizations, the insurance companies, by getting all of them on board, you could then impose this kind of top-down policy.
So this is the censorship industrial complex that you're describing, basically.
I would say this is the pre-phase. This is the governmental infrastructure that makes the censorship possible. This is what builds this kind of top-down coordination that means that when there is a subject that you want to censor, now you have all of the most powerful institutions already aligned, already formed into a kind of organizational network. So the censorship isn't the first order of business with the whole of society necessarily, but it's kind of baked into the approach, and it follows very soon. So if the peak year for the pre-censorship whole of society approach is 2014, let's say, by 2015, that apparatus is already beginning to look at the necessity of not only censorship in the overt sense, but also more subtle forms of informational control, like the establishment of a new fact-checking apparatus, the development of these seemingly innocuous civil society appearing programs like fact-checkers, and who possibly could object to facts, right? The problem, of course, is that these so-called fact-checking organizations, like a very influential one called the International Fact-Checking Network, which would later become the kind of in-house fact-checker for Facebook, the problem with these organizations is that while they have the appearance of neutral civic organizations, they're actually highly partisan and integral to this whole of society coordination of effectively ruling party coordination.
I mean, this is really astonishing, what you're describing. We've kind of lived through some of you will have lived through some of this. Explain to me, so you argue that this information state, really kind of germinated at the end of the last Obama administration. And given what we know now, when we interviewed 3 years ago, I think, we didn't know. There are many things we didn't know that we know today. Can you kind of explain to me what happened, how that happened?
Let me go back a bit farther, actually, if you don't mind. The origins of this in the kind of greater historical context of American politics, it really begins in the Woodrow Wilson administration and the First World War. And it's Wilson who creates the first American propaganda office, which he calls the Committee on Public Information. So the CPI is an official propaganda organ that Wilson creates weeks after he makes the decision to enter the U.S. into World War I, which was a very unpopular decision, a contentious decision that went against his own campaign promise. He had campaigned for re-election in 1912 on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." That was his campaign slogan. Then he brought the U.S. into the war, and rather than entering into kind of bruising political debates where he would have to justify that decision to, hostile politicians, to the general public, instead he creates this government propaganda office called the CPI, headed by a progressive journalist named George Creel. So the CPI is also sometimes known as the Creel Committee. And this invention of an information regulation office by Wilson, on the one hand, it's something he does kind of out of desperation as this emergency measure to deal with the backlash for his decision to bring the U.S. into the war. But on the other hand, it reflects the deepest premises, the deepest philosophical premises of progressivism, of American progressivism. And what I mean by that is that progressive ideology in America, which begins in the late 19th century and Wilson is one of the central figures in articulating the political philosophy of progressivism through his work on administration. Progressivism is the idea that modern society has become too complex for self-government to still apply. So the original principles on which America was founded, that people could reason their way to understanding the world, that they should be entrusted with governing themselves, is really, it's a kind of fairy tale. Wilson and other progressives are arguing in the late 19th century because industrialization, the Industrial Revolution, has introduced a level of complexity that the average person simply isn't capable of understanding. And so the Constitution is a nice kind of folk tale that we might tell ourselves, but it doesn't really apply any longer. And what's going to replace this kind of folk system of democratic self-government, Wilson and others of his ilk argue, is expert administration. So government is going to become the province of technical experts, and these technical experts will control this intricate and complex machinery of modern society. So then you fast forward a century, and you get to the administration of Barack Obama. And what you have is this sort of revitalization of these core ideas of progressivism about the necessity of propaganda, about the power of informational control, but supercharged. Because now, rather than working through the printing press, through the radio, through telegraph, now they're working through a global communications infrastructure which has the ability not only to deliver information to anyone, anywhere on the globe at any moment, but to receive information from all of those people too. And I'm talking, of course, about the internet. And Obama, in his first memoir, his first book, he describes a 2004 visit to Google headquarters in Silicon Valley, where he's taken in to see this three-dimensional rotating globe that Google has. And the globe shows all of the Google searches going on across the world at that moment, with different colored lights to indicate the different languages in which the Google searches are happening. And there's this moment Obama describes in his book where he has a kind of religious reverie. It's like a moment really of a kind of ecstatic revelation where he sees this harmonious global village in this world order where everyone is brought together through this new informational network. And he later gives a speech at Google where he kind of builds on this idea, and he says, what we're going to do together, meaning his administration and Silicon Valley, is we're going to give people good information. People are basically good, and when they get the right information, they make the right decisions. So what we're going to do is we're going to ensure that people get the right information. And there's thunderous applause from the Google employees. And there's this sort of shared vision that by giving people the right information, by controlling the information they receive, in other words, because what does it mean to ensure that people get the right information other than to be the one who dictates what information it is that they receive?
Jacob, one moment, we're going to take a break. And folks, we're going to be right back. And we're back with Jacob Siegel, author of The Information State, Politics in the Age of Total Control. The one thing that does concern me a lot is I look at certain narratives which were, let's say, massively pushed through the system. There's significant, maybe not huge portions of the population, but there's significant portions of the population that believe them.
Yeah, I want to be clear that I don't think that the re-election of Donald Trump defeats the information state, or that the kinds of political challenges, profound political challenges I describe in this book have gone away.
But there has been some dismantling of it, very overt. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. I would agree with that, but there's a deeper, more profound crisis transformative period that we're living through. Mm-hmm. People need to understand that the birth of the digital age is going to be a unbelievably volatile and disruptive event that could last for another century and perhaps even longer, and that it's going to have moments of really intense crisis and then moments where that intense crisis subsides. But the internet, the global digital network that we now live inside, the development of artificial intelligences that are beyond the capacity of even their own programmers to understand, AIs that render decisions, that make judgments that are inscrutable to the people that built them. So we are building intelligences that we cannot understand, that we can't inspect, and therefore there will be a tendency to worship them. There will be idolatry of these things because they will represent a kind of supernatural power that is inevitably going to create cults of idolatry and of AI worship, and there will be wars driven by AI, probably multiple wars driven by AI, and all of this is part of what I'm describing in this book, and all of this is part of the birth of a new kind of political regime.
You know, The Information State is a profound book, and I mean, huge congratulations for writing this. I think it should really be required reading for anybody who is concerned about how our society is going through this, you know, massive transformation. Something that struck me, you know, in the vein of this idolatry, you predict this idolatry of AI. I think it's already here, frankly. We can talk about prosperity coming from division of labor, right? We can talk about prosperity coming from innovation. It seems to me like this vision for the future from some of the most pronounced and important, you know, tech entrepreneurs is that AI is going to actually provide that engine for innovation. Is free thought even important in this type of a context? I'm wondering if you know, people have thought this through entirely, because maybe in this future vision, maybe this is the new technocratic view or the new progressive view that, you know, free thought is something that actually we don't need that anymore.
Well, first of all, thank you for that about the book. I think you're exactly right. I think that's a profound insight. And unfortunately, that is how many of the people in Silicon Valley see it, I believe. Not that they would put it in exactly those terms, that they're looking to eliminate free thought, but they think that the human capacity for reason is, you know, puny and insubstantial compared to what the AIs can do. Now, I think this is a total fallacy, and that AIs cannot reason at all. AIs can calculate, they can compute, they can imitate certain processes of the mind. They cannot imagine. And so I think what we're looking at in this sort of idolatrous AI-mediated future is, let's take the more dire outlook for a moment. It's a scenario in which AIs become so powerful that they generate a kind of worshipful obedience from the general public, who is then given an ever smaller range of options in which to exercise its freedom. So it's not that everything becomes compulsory, it's that the most important decisions are stripped away one by one, and the more of those decisions are stripped away, the less the resistance there is to the next decision being stripped away. In other words, the more freedom people are incentivized to give away by the promise of convenience, optimization, automation of wealth, comfort, the more they are incentivized to give away, the more likely they are to see the rest, their remaining freedom, as diminished in value, and therefore as something that they could also trade away for more comfort, for more security. But China can also design super AIs of control and social automation. That the Chinese can do. What they can't do is innovate. What they can't do is imagine in ways that are more often than not playful where the human being can go next. I mean, this is a real driver of innovation, is play. And the whole human experience, the German philosopher Friedrich Schiller has a brilliant essay on how central play is to what it is to be a human being. And if you're organizing society based on, super AIs that are supposed to be calculating for our needs, for our security concerns, for the optimization of the economy, you are destroying an essential field of the human experience, something that is about what it means to be human. But there's a final element of this, which is who stands behind the AIs. For the vast majority of people, perhaps freedoms are being gradually eroded and degraded and diminished as the AIs gain supremacy. But behind the AIs, there will be a group of human beings who are making decisions. The AIs will not run themselves. They will never run themselves. There will not be a moment of singularity where a general consciousness emerges whereby the AI does not have a human standing behind it. There will always be a human standing behind it, and those people will be able to operate, as in the Wizard of Oz, behind a kind of screen, a contrivance of technological supermastery that will conceal their own power, but they'll be there like pharaohs. They will be there seeming to lord over nature itself. But nevertheless, there will be human beings in control. There always are.
Well, Jacob Siegel, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Jan, an honor. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining Jacob Siegel and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.